Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's one of those slogans we use a lot, especially around July 4th. But what exactly does it mean? Why do we have a right to pursue happiness? The phrase is most frequently associated with the Declaration of Independence, of course. But that's not where it originated. When Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration, he borrowed that phrase from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which had appeared only a few weeks earlier in his home state. That declaration was written by George Mason, and it said people have a right to pursue and obtain happiness and safety. But George Mason didn't invent the idea either. The idea that the purpose of life is the pursuit of happiness is actually thousands of years old, and it goes back to the ancient Greeks, especially philosophers such as Aristotle and Epicurus. These philosophers observed that the basic difference between living things and non-living things is that living things are able to act on their own, to pursue goals. Rocks can't do that, but animals and even plants do. They take actions in order to make themselves, happy. We talk about plants thriving or animals flourishing and people finding happiness or living a well-lived life. Aristotle and Epicurus said the goal of all our actions in life is to achieve that kind of fulfillment. That doesn't mean that we do whatever feels good. On the contrary, doing whatever feels good at the time is a good way to end up unhappy. Epicurus said it is impossible to live a pleasant life without living wisely and well and justly, and it is impossible to live wisely and well and justly without living a pleasant life. To put it more simply, there's a difference between happiness and fun. Fun is an important part of happiness, but a genuinely happy life is more long-term and a bit more serious. It requires planning and hard work, and even requires enduring some unpleasant things. But the purpose of a well-lived life is so that when we're older, we can look back and say that we lived our lives well, that we were all that we could be. Actually, to be precise, Epicurus and Aristotle disagreed a little about what they meant by pursuing happiness. Aristotle thought that it meant an active effort to become our best selves. Epicurus thought of it more like tranquility, a calm lack of disharmony. But whatever their disagreements, they agreed that pursuing happiness means living our most fulfilling lives. In fact, that idea became so closely associated with Epicurus that it's where we get the word Epicurean, which means someone who likes good food. That makes sense because Epicurus thought we should take pleasure in worldly things, including delicious food. But he and his followers were by no means into self-indulgence. They believed in taking pleasure in fine things, but doing so wisely and in moderation. These ideas were largely lost after the fall of Rome, when the Christian church declared them sacrilegious. The church said that the purpose of life was definitely not the pursuit of happiness. On the contrary, happiness in this life was considered sinful and disgraceful. The real purpose of life, it said, was to sacrifice yourself for the benefit of other people, or for the king, or for God. Theologians and political leaders therefore preached meekness and subordination instead of self-reliance and independence. The medieval monk Meister Eckhart, for example, wrote that obedience brings out the best of everything. You will never hear an obedient person saying, I want it so-and-so, I must have this or that. You will hear only of utter denial of self. Therefore do not say, give me virtue, but only give me nothing but what God wills, for there is no I want this in true obedience. In other words, for Eckhart, the real ideal was absolute subjection. Even wishing to be a better person was too selfish for his tastes. Things began to change during the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, in part because of the rediscovery of Aristotle's and Epicurus's writings. Philosophers began going back to the idea that the purpose of life isn't to make other people happy or to make government stronger, but instead so that we could accomplish our own ends. The philosopher John Locke, the most influential philosopher for the American founding fathers, had some interesting things to say on this point. Morality, he said, is the rule of our actions for the attaining of happiness, for the end and aim of all people being happiness alone. Nothing could be a rule or law to them whose observation did not lead to happiness. and whose breach did not draw misery after it. It is a person's proper business to seek happiness and avoid misery. Of course, if the purpose of life is the pursuit of happiness, then there's no reason for government to make choices for us. Each of us should be free to make our own choices and, of course, pay for our own mistakes. When America's founding fathers spoke of the pursuit of happiness, they had this idea in mind: that the government should protect our rights so we can navigate our own choices as we see fit. As philosopher Leonard Peikoff put it, the right to live means the right to sustain and protect one's life. It means the right to take all the actions required by the nature of a rational being for the preservation of his life. The right to the pursuit of happiness is the right to live for one's own sake and fulfillment. Now, there's an angle to this that people often fail to appreciate. That's economic freedom. Think about it. One of the main ways in which we pursue happiness is through work. We work not only to pay the bills and provide for ourselves and our families, but also because many of us view our work as a form of self-expression. Our jobs are often crucial to what we consider happiness. But at the time of the American Revolution, the British government often trampled on the right to earn a living. It was illegal, for example, for American colonists to make things out of certain raw materials. Instead, you had to send raw materials to Britain to be made into goods and then sent back to America for sale, which not only made things more expensive, but deprived Americans of the freedom to run their own businesses. Ben Franklin said in 1768, "There cannot be a stronger natural right than that of a man's making the best profit he can of the natural produce of his lands." But British regulations of iron manufacturers and hat makers and other businesses required that Americans send raw materials to England to be made into consumer goods and then shipped back, which made things more expensive and made it harder for American colonists to earn an honest living. That was unjust because it infringed on the right to pursue happiness through one's own business. The reason the British government imposed these restrictions was because it thought people should be working for the betterment of the British Empire, not just for themselves. Under the economic theory known as mercantilism, the purpose of the economy wasn't to make people better off. It was to make the government economically powerful. And Parliament accomplished this by promoting the interests of businesses, not their customers. It was because of that idea that the British government often prohibited people from selling things to other countries or buying things from other countries. Politicians didn't want their country's businesses to have to compete with foreign businesses. Worse still, English laws prohibited people from starting a business without getting the government's permission first in the form of licensing laws. Beginning in the 17th century, English courts started striking down these laws, declaring that they violated the Magna Carta and deprived people of their right to use their skills and industry to provide for themselves and their families. And that was what the American founding fathers meant when they spoke of the pursuit of happiness. Not just the right to live your own life freely, but specifically the right to put your knowledge and skills to work to provide for yourself and make a living as well as a life. Remember how George Mason put it in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. We have the right to the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. In other words, we should be free to acquire, to earn, and to build the foundation of happiness without unjust interference. We don't live to make the government rich and strong. We work to earn our own happiness. I emphasize this because nowadays economic freedom tends to be treated as unimportant, like it's a trivial part of what freedom means. But the right to start and run a business or to take a job or to hire someone is essential. It's not just a key to prosperity, it's also that economic freedom is empowering to the individual. Maybe that's why we often call it the American dream. It's no coincidence that political and religious tyrannies have so often preached the notion that happiness is a sin or that selfishness is evil. The desire to respect and improve and preserve the self is something no dictator or slave master can stand. If your life and your happiness belong to you, if you have a right to try to become your best self, then there's no reason to submit yourself to the control of political authorities. From ancient Greece to the present day, the cause of liberty has always been the cause of the self.